Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. Today is a schmooze day, which means that we ordinarily don't know what we're going to talk about. We're bringing together some people who may or may not know each other. And usually we sort of get acquainted and find out what we're all interested in. This time I have some preconceptions about what we may discuss because I've already not exactly rehearsed it, but I've been talking with two of my guests, and the third guest is the newcomer in a way. So let me start off. We've got three guests coming up. Ellen Thomas, who's in Washington, D.C. She is the co-chair of WILP's End Wars campaign. WILP is the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. She's the head of Proposition 1, Non-Radioactive Nuclear Review. She's the founder of the Washington Peace House, and she's editor of Nuke News. But I think the most interesting thing in her background, for me anyway, because I've never done such a thing, is that for many years, she more or less lived as a vigil, in a vigil at the White House for a very long time. So I'm going to ask her in a minute to tell us about that and about what's on her mind now. But in near Ottawa is Earl Turcotte, who is a former Canadian diplomat. He worked for Canada. He worked at the United Nations, and I know that he was extremely instrumental in working on the is it cluster munitions?
Convention on cluster munitions, yes.
Convention on cluster munitions. He was upset by what was going on in Cambodia and Laos, I think, and certainly made a wonderful case that those damn things ought to be abolished. And in Ottawa is Robin Collins, who is well. Let's see which of your multiple hats. What is your most notable hat these days? What do you call yourself?
I'm a longtime peace activist in Ottawa.
Well, you're co-chair of the Canadian Network to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, right? And that's.
I'm not speaking for them today.
Hi, Ellen, and welcome to Canada. So tell me about this business about the vigil that you maintained at the White House. I didn't know such a thing was possible. And then whatever else cause is uppermost on your mind today.
Okay. In 1981, there was a fellow by the name of William Thomas who sat down in front of the White House with a sign that said "Wanted Wisdom and Honesty," and didn't go away and was there until he died in 2009. And in 1984, I met him. And we were married 6 weeks later, and I quit my job at the National Wildlife Federation and joined the Vigil, and we worked together for 25 years to abolish nuclear weapons.
Wow.
And during that time, and it's a 24-hour-a-day vigil, of course, no one person can be there 24 hours a day, and there were lots of people who helped out over the years. But I was there most of the time for 18 years. And then my husband's mother died and left us some money, which we used to buy a derelict building in DC and fixed it up and turned it into the Peace House. And so in 2002, I began managing the Peace House and helping to keep the vigil going, but I was not out there all the time anymore. But the most significant, there were lots of wonderful adventures, and I'm writing a book about it, but whenever I have time. But the most significant thing that we did was in 1993, we brought a voter initiative, Initiative 37, to the voters of DC, asking the Congresswoman, Eleanor Holmes Norton, who was a new Congresswoman at the time, to introduce legislation. And she did when we won. And for 16 times now, she has introduced what is now called the Nuclear Weapons Abolition and Economic and Energy Conversion Act, which is HR 2850 in this session.
In Congress?
In Congress, in the U.S. Congress, yeah.
And she's from D.C., is she?
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Okay.
You can't call her representative because DC is not considered a state. But she's able to introduce legislation. She's able to serve on committees. She's not able to vote, which is wrong.
That's sort of strange. She can introduce a law, but she can't vote for it. Huh?
Yeah,
Okay.
which is unfortunate.
Okay. Now tell me about this bill.
Well, if you go to prop1.org, that's prop1.org, it gives you the background, it gives you links to where you can read it, and how you can write to the Senate and to the House of Representatives. There's a couple of links on bit.ly. One is Prop 1 petition, which if you sign that, you send a letter to your representative if you're in the United States, asking for co-sponsorship. And there's also a bit.ly WILP US -ban treaty petition that takes you to the Senate and to the president asking for signature and ratification of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Now, when the bill was first introduced, of course, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons didn't exist. That didn't come around until 2017, didn't go into effect until 2021. But it is part of Eleanor Holmes Norton's bill, and it says that the U.S. will enter into a binding agreement such as the TPNW to abolish all nuclear weapons and to use the money that's saved to transform the economy to a carbon-free, nuclear-free economy, and to provide for human needs. So it's nuclear weapons abolition and economic conversion, especially.
Okay, now was that that carbon connection built into the bill right from the beginning, or
No. Yeah.
when did that get added? Because it's, we're only gradually becoming aware of how bad our situation is, and making the connection between nuclear weapons and war in general, but and our energy and climate issues.
I'm not sure exactly what year it was. This was an idea that I presented and she accepted, and it's been going on for a while now.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, did they ever bring this up for a vote, or what happens to her bill?
No, it's been assigned to the Armed Services and the Foreign Affairs committees, and it never gets out of committee. If you look up HR 2850 co-sponsors, in the 117th Congress, you will see a list of the co-sponsors, and it's not very long, but it's good people, and there have been different representatives who have co-sponsored over the years. We need a lot more co-sponsors, which is why we're asking people not only to sign the letter to the representative or the senators, but also to get a little more active and start calling and writing to your legislators and say, support the TPNW. This is really important. It's so important for us to do this.
Yeah, well, all three of us, you can be sure all of us are very engaged with the issue of nuclear weapons and TPNW in Canada, because it's easy for us often to say, to believe that somehow Canada is a morally superior country because we don't get into quite as many fights as the U.S. does. But when it comes to supporting the TPNW, we're no better off, I think.
Certainly with respect to TPNW, Meta, you're absolutely right. I mean, we had almost a very embarrassing intervention by the Prime Minister before TPNW was negotiated, when negotiations were announced, referring to it in the House of Commons as useless, because at that time it was well known that none of the nuclear weapon states would participate in negotiations. The government of Canada has since softened its tone with respect to TPNW, but still does not support it, will not become party to it, and reverts, along with other NATO states and others, including all nuclear weapon states, to discussion of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, that was, I guess, entered into force, I believe, in 1970, as the pillar of nuclear disarmament. And ironically, of the three pillars within the NPT, one, proliferation, where I think it's arguably been relatively successful, especially in light of current events, and we'll get to that in a moment. Two, access to nuclear technology for peaceful purposes. That was guaranteed, in effect, in the NPT. That was negotiated into the instrument. But three, disarmament, actual disarmament, where it has been an abysmal failure. One could make the case that the bilateral disarmament initiatives in the former Soviet Union and the United States that reduced their respective arsenals quite dramatically, ironically, much of it done during the Cold War period, was successful. But in terms of multilateral disarmament, all 9 nuclear weapon states, that hasn't happened. And as I'm sure this audience knows well, we are now engaged in a new nuclear arms race. I think this was precipitated in large part by the United States that announced that it would allocate, I believe, $30 billion, is it, Ellen, over the next 30 years, or
$1.7 trillion.
Pardon me, yes, of course, 1.7, or I thought it was about $1.5 trillion over the next 30 years to, quote, modernize its nuclear weapons. Now, all other nuclear weapon states have followed suit, and they're not only modernizing, in some cases they are expanding, and they are also developing new capacity in some cases where they didn't have nuclear armed submarines, they now do. So, and I suspect that when we get to the discussion about what is happening in Ukraine today and the possible consequences of the action and the inaction that is being taken by states, that we will see proliferation on steroids.
That sounds opposite to what I was thinking. I was thinking the very fact that Putin has been actually threatening to use nuclear weapons in the last couple of weeks would be a good impetus to people who are sitting on the fence. It should make people think, yeah, maybe these things are still dangerous, and maybe we really ought to do something about it.
Okay, I cannot see a better example of a confluence of two competing issues here. One is the urgency for abolition on one hand, and on the other, the embrace towards NATO and a nuclear deterrent by other states who look at Putin and say, thank goodness we had nuclear weapons, otherwise, who knows what he might do. It is the absolute best situation here for a discussion about the urgent problem of nuclear abolition. I cannot think of a better example. I mean, on one hand, it would appear that nuclear for Putin, nuclear deterrence works because NATO states have vocally and publicly stated that they're not going to get involved in this fight because of the risk of not only escalation to a global conventional war, but potentially to a nuclear war with no knowledge whatsoever of what Putin might do, particularly considering his threats and his upgrading of putting nuclear weapons on alert at their highest level in Russia. So now we're down to the real conversation about, Ellen's project, I think, embraces well, that is the necessity for abolition of nuclear weapons and a transformation of towards a more cooperative security and an economy that enables that. So, let the conversation about abolition begin, because we're facing it right now. I mean, what can Putin get away with right now because of the concern that he might go to nuclear weapons?
So it certainly does look like proof that deterrence works, because he can deter the U.S. Enough so that he can do whatever he pleases.
You don't mind, kind of in hot pursuit. First of all, Meta, I don't disagree that there, and I think Robin's characterization of a confluence of, I'll use the word impulses right now, or I'd say competing impulses. On one hand, here in the disarmament community, we've been complaining for years that this issue simply didn't command the attention of the public. Well, it certainly is front and center now. I think as much as it has been probably since 1962. I mean, people have to be seized of this issue. That is a good thing. And I think there will be a cry, an outcry, outrage that these weapons continue to exist, and that, to date, the 9 nuclear weapon states have made no serious effort to follow through on their disarmament obligations, and these are legally binding obligations. On the other hand, this is the other way it can go, and I would, if you haven't seen it, there was an article, I think that was yesterday, in the Hill Times. That's a paper here in Canada that's widely read by parliamentarians and government officials, and indeed leaders across Canada and academics. But it was an article by Gwynne Dyer, and it's entitled "Ukraine's Nuclear Mistake." And I'll just read the first line to you, or the first couple of lines. He says, "It turns out that not only evil dictators need nuclear weapons, any country that has a nuclear-armed neighbor with a grievance urgently needs them too. Indeed, any country that thinks it might one day find itself in confrontation with a nuclear-armed country, however far away it may be, needs nuclear weapons."
Whoa, wow.
I think, if you've read Gwynne Dyer a lot, you know that he doesn't subscribe to that point of view. He doesn't think this is a good thing. But the point he's making is that the lesson has been lost on no one. And he goes on to talk about Ukraine, that as I'm sure you know, that in 92, the dissolution of the Soviet Union had, I think it was 1,900 nuclear weapons on its territory, and was cajoled and persuaded by both Russia and the US to repatriate them to Russia, ostensibly for destruction. So it gave up its nuclear deterrent capacity, if you like. He makes the point that if Ukraine had nuclear weapons today, would it have been invaded by Russia? Probably absolutely not. And that lesson is lost on no one. So, as I say, I think there will be at the same time an impulse with states that are inclined to want to up their capacity for deterrence to go nuclear. And at the same time, hopefully, people around the world will lobby in favor of going in the absolute opposite direction, and that is to total elimination of nuclear weapons so that we never, ever face this existential threat again.
In order to get rid of nuclear weapons, we're going to also have to transform the war economy. And we need to figure out a way to make it appealing to the arms merchants to change to mass producing carbon-free, nuclear-free energy systems, for example, something that they can make money at, something that they will profit and start doing something that is good for humanity. The reason that we have so many weapons is because they're profitable. If they weren't profitable, then we wouldn't have them. And so one of the things about Norton's bill is that it says to use the money saved from the nuclear weapons, that $1.7 trillion is going to be sunk into, is in the process of being sunk into modernizing the nuclear weapons industries, the nuclear weapons, to use that money to transform the arms industries so that they don't have to go out of business. They can change their business so that they don't have to fire their employees. They can retrain their employees. And that's one of the things that's built into Eleanor Holmes Norton's bill. Because so long as we have armies and navies that are threatening each other with these conventional weapons, then people are going to want to have nuclear weapons to protect themselves. So it's a massive task. But this is what the UN's been working for the last 70 years and 75 years, whatever it is. And we have to be consistent in encouraging people to think that it's possible. Our biggest problem is the apathy that comes with despair. People don't want to think about this issue because it seems impossible to change.
Yeah.
And then
Well,
we
you know
find
what? I
ourselves
think
on-
that Earl has pointed out, in fact, both Earl and Robin have pointed out that the terms of the discussion have just been jerked around in a totally different direction now. Because, you know, I would say in the last 10 years, or you put a date on it, the discussion has moved away from whether or not deterrence works and whether or not nuclear weapons are really a particularly dangerous thing that we have to worry about, to more of a discussion about, well, we need to pay much more attention to climate. And unless we get rid of nuclear weapons, we can't afford to do all the things that we should on climate. So your bill would be reflective of that discourse about the connection between climate and the economy and nuclear weapons. But now, if you know, as Robin has just pointed out, this has moved us around front and center, so that we're thinking not now about the important. In fact, what has really happened, I think, as a result of this war, is everything else is now forgotten. We're not talking about climate. We weren't talking about it enough anyway, but we're sure not talking about it now. We're not even talking about COVID anymore. We're talking about that war 24 hours a day. And in the terms of that war, you got a strong case made there, Earl, that if Ukraine had possessed nuclear weapons, Russia wouldn't have done it. And if Windyer's right, it's a strong argument that they gave up something that would have made all the difference in the world. And it's a terrible thing to recognize.
Absolutely. Yes, it's exactly the wrong message that should go out to the rest of the world, but unfortunately, that is one of the messages.
Mm-hmm.
The thing that Ellen hinted at was doing away with nuclear weapons is insufficient because you know, conventional war can be a bloody project, and in fact, if you're on the lower end of capacity in conventional weapons, then the likelihood of you creeping back towards nuclear weapons is increased. What you need to create is not only a piece of paper, a treaty that everyone agrees to. You need to create the conditions within which the desire for military supremacy, which of course is topped off with nuclear weapons capacity at the very end point of it. You need to replace all of that with something else, some kind of cooperative enablement of security within Europe and more broadly. So then you have to look at the credibility of Putin's argument about, you know, his concern about NATO expansion, so-called. You do have to look at that and see what a replacement security would look like, even if Putin is using that as a justification for his other ambition. So we need to get very quickly, not only, towards the abolition argument, but we have to at the same time look at the cooperative security argument, so that this kind of thing doesn't happen again. You can draw different lessons from the same event. But we do know that everybody getting nuclear weapons as a deterrent and the risks involved in that situation are not likely to create a more stable Earth. But if we're eliminating nuclear weapons and the alternative is conventional weapons build-up, arms race, that will lead to breakout towards nuclear weapons again, then we really have to get into the nitty-gritty of this. And it is very complicated, but the political will, if it ever existed, should be starting now, because at the end of the war, what is going to happen? Are Finland going to join NATO? Is Moldova going to want to join NATO? Is Georgia what's going to happen immediately after this war? And how do you satiate somebody like Putin, who has these? We don't know the extent of his aggressive ambitions. We are speculating, and right now people think that he could go broader than Ukraine or not. NATO seems to think that he won't go past the border. They may be right. They may be wrong.
Yeah.
So it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity. It's a golden opportunity.
It is an
actually talk about everything right now.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if the countries of NATO that don't themselves have nuclear weapons but are harboring nuclear weapons of the United States, if they were to say that they will send the U.S. nuclear weapons home and not have them, if that would help at all.
It seems like a good signal to me.
Yeah.
It would be, but I can't see it happening, to be honest. I mean, Germany, case in point, I think it just announced that it's going to, if I heard correctly, double its defense budget. If anything, they're going to build up their deterrence capability, and that probably includes nuclear. And of course, they host American nuclear weapons at this time. I think 4 other NATO states do as well.
Yeah, the result of Putin's gamble is the opposite of what he claims he wants to impose on Ukraine. The interest in joining NATO by other states increases. The interest in having nuclear weapons at the ready. The interest in setting up conventional weapons along Russia's border to prevent some kind of incursion from that. The interest in joining the European Union is increased. Everything that he is doing is generating the opposite of what he claims are his objectives.
Yep. Many people have said that NATO bears some complicity by creating the conditions under which this has happened, and I certainly agree with that. Mm-hmm. And I think it was an additional 8 states joining NATO after 1992, if I've got the numbers correct. The expansion of NATO right up to Russia's borders. But one thing about that has always confused me, and I might be missing something. There is the issue of geographic proximity. The theory is that the closer nuclear weapons are to our borders, the more dangerous the situation is. And at one level, that is very, very true, of course. But in as much as certainly the major nuclear weapon states all have nuclear-armed submarines, and I think it's only reasonable to assume that those submarines are very close to the borders of their perceived or real adversaries, it really becomes academic. And, as to whether or not they're close to your borders, I mean, we have to accept the fact that that interval of time between an attack and the detection of that attack and a response has been reduced so far that the moment there is a deliberate act or a miscalculation, it's pretty much over at that stage. So this is an unbelievably dangerous situation that promises to get even more dangerous if these weapons proliferate. And even if they don't, given the level of tension that there currently is in the world, and it's going to be around for years to come.
Okay, I think clearly the thing has been exacerbated by Putin's recent threats, but he's not the only one who was blurring the taboo. NATO would itself be talking about the possible use of tactical nuclear weapons, a shot across the bow, as they sometimes put it, a sort of a warning message that you could use a nuclear weapon here or there, now and then, a little bit, and not get into trouble. And if that point of view was kind of oozing into acceptability without being really discussed and acknowledged by the general public in Western circles, then we can't just blame Putin for having awakened us to the issue. Some people anyway saying, yeah, you could use nuclear weapons of a certain type now and then or something. Am I right or not?
Yeah.
Who are you thinking of as having said this?
Well, actually, it was. I believe the issue came up in the American Nuclear Posture Review, I think about 2 years ago. I have it here somewhere, but I can't put my hands on it. But there was an assertion that a limited nuclear intervention could be instrumental in the Allies prevailing. And this, of course, is just anathema to the peace community around the world. And it seems at the same time incredibly wrong-headed, just from a pure logical perspective, because first of all, I think most people would agree that there is no such thing as a tactical nuclear weapon. All nuclear weapons, if a nuclear weapon is used anywhere, it will likely precipitate a response from the opposite side, so whether strategic or tactical. Low yield for a nuclear weapon is still an unbelievably powerful explosion, and with the radioactive fallout and everything else that would ensue, the effect on climate and whatnot, it would be devastating, absolutely devastating. And it wasn't just the United States by any means. I mean, India and Pakistan have been, developing tactical nuclear weapons, and there was even discussion of deploying or delegating, rather, launch authority to field commanders, in particular in the Kashmir region. Now, can you imagine what a powder keg that is? So these so-called tactical nuclear weapons with lower yields, instead of being less dangerous, in fact, have made the world more dangerous. And that's why they all have to go.
One has to give President Biden the credit for not putting American nuclear weapons on high alert, as a consequence of what Putin did. The escalation from tactical to all-out nuclear war it has been predicted. I mean, it's not only anybody can do this, but all the wargaming that has been done in the past. And Daryl Kimball has a good piece in the current Bulletin of Atomic Scientists on. He mentions this as well. Mm-hmm. In any case where there is a conflict between, I believe it's Russia and the United States. It might be NATO and Russia, but anyway, same argument. Even beginning with conventional war, it ultimately leads to nuclear war. So, I mean, that's just conventional war between the two directly. Mm-hmm. Forget about tactical nuclear weapons, which clearly goes to the worst possible situation.
Even Truman said, you blame me for using this, but, anytime there's a real war and between countries that have them, they will be used. Like there's no way you can suddenly maintain a line that,
This is where there's some disagreement on what to do with respect to Ukraine and whether a state should support Ukraine at this point militarily.
right. Okay. I don't know whether you are willing to wade into that at the moment, Earl, but you differ from the majority of the Canadian activists who are friends of yours on the question of what to do to help Ukraine. So give us your point of view.
Sure. Just before I do that, I'd like to just read a couple of things I took away from President Zielinski's address to the Canadian House of Commons this morning. He spoke for, I believe, 12 minutes, and he made some pretty key points, and I just jotted a few of them down. The first one is he characterized what is happening in his country as an attempt to destroy our country, our nation, our identity. He has referred to this on several occasions now at this stage as a war of attrition. Ukrainians show no sign that they're going to give up. And even if they are occupied by the Russians, there will be urban warfare and guerrilla warfare probably for many years to come because Ukrainians will never stop fighting. So you can just begin to imagine the long-term and even the short-term cost to Ukraine of what's ongoing. Second thing is, he said, we are asking for justice. And in the next breath, he said, we have come to know who our real friends are. Please expand your efforts, Canada, and help us bring peace back to our country. And then he made, perhaps not in this order, but he made a powerful plea for assistance to establish a no-fly zone. He said, we need to stop the bombs, we need to stop the cruise missiles. And the implication is that they can't do it themselves with their current capacity. So it begs the question, is not just is Canada doing enough, but is the rest of the world doing enough? And Meta, what you're referring to in terms of and Robin as well, in terms of the disagreement, is in an ongoing discussion on whether or not we are doing enough. And the case I've tried to make is that we should do absolutely everything possible using nonviolent means, first of all, to bring Russia to the negotiating table, to withdraw their forces, to cease hostilities and go to the negotiating table. And I think there are things we can do further. I mean, in terms of sanctions and isolating Russia from the rest of the world. I mean, my understanding is that Germany is still accepting gas imports from Russia. Now, they need them. Russia has not been completely isolated yet economically by the West, but we're moving in that direction. There are many other things that can be done. I think that just a small anecdote. Back in the 90s, I used to moonlight and do a little bit of television interviewing, and I interviewed a representative of the African National Congress about what brought about an end to apartheid. And he said something that surprised the hell out of me. He said, in addition to all the political pressure that was brought to bear and the economic pressure that was brought to bear, one of the things that really, really bothered people was when we were kept out of international sport. He said, we love sports in South Africa. He said that affected everybody. He said, the apartheid regime, and that brought a lot of pressure to bear. So I've made the case where, that Russia should be excluded not only from the Olympics, but every other type of international competition, cultural events. There are many things that we can do of a nonviolent nature to step up the isolation of Russia and bring more pressure to bear. But what do we do in a situation where that doesn't work? And President Zielinski and many others have made the case that to date, it has not worked. It is not enough. Putin seems to be doubling down. He probably has a virtually endless capacity or soldiers and equipment that can be brought into Ukraine and to do his worst. And the situation is not helped, in my view, by the fact that NATO in particular has told him explicitly that we will not intervene directly. We will fight to defend every square inch of NATO territory, but we will not interfere directly in Ukraine. This, to my mind, has virtually given Putin a green light. And the message seems to be, well, if you can withstand the pressure of sanctions and you think you can take the Ukraine military and their citizens, even with the inflow of materials from the rest of the world, then he basically has he has free rein to go ahead and do that. So what I have personally concluded is that now is the time for the rest of the world to directly confront Putin, and I mean militarily, in the establishment and enforcement of no-fly zone and the reinforcement of troops and equipment to bolster the Ukrainian forces so that they can not only challenge the Russians, but actually expel them from their country. Now, of course, what are the risks associated with that? Well, we've heard it. Escalation, first and foremost, and a possible third world war, and all of that ensues, including perhaps the use of nuclear weapons. Sorry. There is, to my mind, a misapprehension that NATO is not prepared to bear those risks, because they say they give the message to Ukraine and to the Russians that they have given on one hand, and then the next breath, they say all bets are off if you invade a NATO country. We will bring everything that is necessary to bear, all means, to directly confront anybody who attacks a NATO country in keeping with Article 5 of the NATO Charter. So in fact, in reality, NATO is prepared to confront Russia or anybody else. They are prepared to take the risks of escalation. They are prepared even to risk fighting with a nuclear armed state, but not for Ukraine. Not for Ukraine. They'll do it for all 30 NATO states, but not for Ukraine. So that to me is an intellectual dissonance and a moral dissonance that I find very, very hard to fathom. So I think, and also it is a gamble. I am not naive. I've been around, and I know that raises the possibility that nuclear weapons could be used and whatnot. But I also maintain that the long-term risks of inaction might far exceed those of action at this point in a contained environment with a man without conscience who is inhumane and everything else, yes, but a man who I truly believe is not mad, but he is calculating, he is narcissistic, he is ambitious, but I don't think he is a madman. So that I think that if the ante is up high enough, that he will conclude that he has, first of all, he doesn't want to go down in history as the man who precipitated the end of Russia and possibly the end of the world. And I think he will withdraw if confronted with sufficient force. That may not be the case for the next person who has access and decides that they're going to make threats with nuclear weapons. In particular, of course, if it's a terrorist organization that gets their hands on nukes, then all bets are off. So I just think that if we in the West, and NATO in particular, are prepared to bear those risks at some point, including against Russia, now is the time to do it. Let's not sacrifice Ukraine. Let's give the Ukrainians what they need to fight back. And at the same time, give Mr. Putin absolute assurances right up front, be very clear on this, that the West would never consider first use of nuclear weapons, and also that immediately upon the cessation of hostilities, that there would be full diplomatic negotiation to establish security measures that will satisfy the needs of Russia and Ukraine, and indeed hopefully many other states in both the short and the long term. Now, I've been a peace activist for many years. I've worked for peace and development my whole career, indeed my whole life. But I am not a pacifist. I do believe that there is a time for what we call violence. I think that's the wrong word, when you are intervening in a very material and physical way to defend yourself or defend other innocents. And there's never been a clear-cut case of an unjustified aggressor, in this case, killing and possibly destroying a whole nation. While we stand by and provide some support short of anything that's really going to do the job.
I agree with almost everything Earl says, except his conclusion. and the reason is, I don't believe we know that this won't escalate to global war and possible nuclear use. I don't think we know that NATO would respond in kind if Putin stepped across the Ukrainian border for the same reasons NATO is willing to give Putin a free ride of Ukraine now because of concern about escalation. It's not impossible that if Putin did step over the border, it's a very weird red line situation that we're having this conversation about. We are counting on Putin's fear of escalation if he goes 1 inch past the Ukrainian border, and that NATO would respond. As Earl says, if NATO is unwilling to respond now, why would they respond if he were to go into Poland?
Mm-hmm.
We don't know if he would or not. We don't know whether NATO would or not. We think NATO would. There's another kind of odd situation, a curious alignment that I've seen, wherein Putin's goals, in a sense, have lined up with many within the peace movement and certain left-wing groups who see NATO as the primary problem, let's say. Mm-hmm. And even anti-nuclear abolitionists who, don't want nuclear war no matter what, and therefore all the above are willing to concede to Putin virtually anything he wants in Ukraine for fear of war, escalation, nuclear war. And to the extent that some are justifying or finding arguments to reinforce some of Putin's arguments on, he's got 5 main demands. There's some validity to each one of his demands, but that's not the point. The point is he has engaged in an illegal invasion. He's committing war crimes and atrocities. He's targeting civilians. He's hitting hospitals. He's hitting schools. None of this is ever acceptable. And his arguments for doing so don't stand up to what he's doing now. Ukraine, not joining NATO, for instance. Let's say that's his primary argument, that Ukraine should not join NATO. So how is it that what he's doing now will prevent the desire of Ukraine to join NATO unless he, removes the government of Ukraine and occupies the country indefinitely, which seems an absolutely impossible task for Russia to do. And I ask myself, is Ukraine to be sacrificed now? Because the alternative is escalation, global war, possibly nuclear war.
But if I may, Robin, I don't think that is the alternative.
Let me go even one more ugly step. should the Ukrainians who are outgunned and outnumbered by the Russians, who I would think most people would say cannot possibly win on their own against the Russian juggernaut with their 200,000 troops surrounding and their capacity, much of which they haven't used, including their aircraft. Should Ukraine surrender, knowing that if they don't surrender, this will be a massive slaughter over a period of time? And I'm not a pacifist either. And if I was in Ukraine, I would think that I would probably be fighting back too, even knowing that the slaughter would continue, escalate, prolong, and maybe no way out. So this is a horrific question for all of us to think about. And how much is Ukraine willing to give Putin to acknowledge his blackmail, his overwhelming power, military power, and NATO's inability to engage in the war? If we send weapons sort of under the table, does this not just prolong the situation, sort of with a wink, wink, nod, nod? We're not engaged militarily. We're doing it sort of under the table. Does this just prolong the situation so that death in Ukraine continues and gets worse?
You know, people said that the reason that Ukraine isn't enjoying the kind of protection that a NATO state does is because there isn't the same legal obligation as exists in the NATO Charter. This is true. But I'd like to remind people that there is an obligation under the principle of the responsibility to protect, R2P, which I believe everyone here is very familiar with. I mean, this principle was adopted by every country that attended the UN World Summit in 2005. And it was in particular, it emerged in response to the mass atrocities in Russia and the former Yugoslavia. And its purpose is to halt or not allow ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide. Now, what's happening in Ukraine, I think, qualifies as at least two of those, if not more. As I say, so that obligation, that formal obligation already exists, and it's incumbent upon the rest of the world to intervene, in my view, to protect Ukraine. So it's not just a moral obligation, but a formal legal obligation that has been adopted under the auspices of the United Nations. Not to say that the UN is going to intervene militarily, but the member states of the UN who are like-minded, I believe, should at this point. Not a declaration of war against Russia. Make it very clear this would be limited engagement with the sole purpose of expelling Russian troops from Ukrainian territory. This is not all-out war on Russia. I agree, that would result in world war, and nobody wants that. But I think if managed well, this is possible.
So,
hey, there is an argument that, you know, if you use responsibility to protect and go in to protect them, you do it by destroying them. I mean, the military activity itself is exactly the thing that we want to prevent. That is not going to benefit anybody. Last week, I blurted in by saying, if I were Zielinski, what I would do is remove everybody, evacuate as many people as possible, then surrender and tell the Russians, come right in if you think you can run things, because we're going to do non-cooperation. We're going to resist you non-violently, and you will not be able to govern this country. But it will still be intact. There will be buildings, there'll be things still left of Ukraine. We'll be saving Ukraine to live and go fight another day, but fight nonviolently with the assistance of the rest of the world on these economic sanctions and the refusal to use Russian oil and gas, all these other things that the rest of the world is doing. If the world keeps up this pressure and they conducted a civil resistance movement in an intact country that hasn't been flattened, which it will be, and it would be flattened by your action too, Earl, I think that we would have, that's the most promising solution to the thing. I was going to invite some people to have a conversation today about the very notion of civilian-based defense in Ukraine, but I couldn't put it together so quickly. So as soon as I can, I'm going to have some people who've given a lot of thought to this question of civilian-based defense and civil resistance. Anyway, I think, Robin, I cut you off, and you'll get the last word.
Okay, well, thank you. So a few things. Civilian defense in the current circumstances is off the table. If there was a peace agreement on Putin's term that led to a ceasefire and then some kind of stability, then a civil movement might engage in the detritus of that situation going forward. Right now, we're in a war situation, but let me clarify. Responsibility to protect. I'm an ardent supporter of the idea of responsibility to protect. There's two things. One is the concept of protecting, as Earl mentioned, civilians against atrocities. The structural part of it is that you cannot implement responsibly protect without the Security Council, which would be vetoed by Russia. So responsibly protect would not come into play in this current situation. What does come into play is Article 51 of the UN Charter, which is self-defense. Ukraine has the right under international law to protect itself and to call for other states to come to its defense in support of that self-defense if the Security Council is unable to do anything about it. So we're in that situation right now. Article 51 does not refer to a UN action, which would be peacekeeping or UN authorized military action. Article 51 refers to self-defense outside of the United Nations. It's legal for Ukraine to defend itself and to ask others to help it. This returns to the same problem of the extending of the resistance of Ukraine to Putin and the escalation of the conflict by other states coming to Ukraine's aid in the face of Putin and what that might lead to. So we are back to the same conversation about what will end this war to remove or reduce the violence as fast as possible, and what concessions have to be made, and what principles are defended or excluded in those decisions.
Okay, I'm afraid we've run way over time. So we obviously need to continue this conversation. So we will do so in another day. So thank you very much, everybody. And it's been stimulating and not exactly fun, but bless you all. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, man.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Project Save the World produces one of these shows 3 days a week and sometimes more. This is episode 423. You can watch these or listen to them as audio podcasts on our website, tosavetheworld.ca. Eventually, we even post the transcripts there. When you get to the website, look around because we have conversations going on there all the time about 6 global issues, plus potential reforms in governance, economics, and civil society. To find a particular talk show, enter its title or episode number in the search bar, or the name of one of the guest speakers. After you've watched or listened, scroll down and share your thoughts about the show with the other viewers. This is a place for dialogue, so please join in. See you there.